Ohio Fireball. On July 26, 2017, 18-year-old Tyler Jarrell spent opening night of the Ohio State Fair with his girlfriend, Keziah Lewis, and a group of friends, working their way through the Midway in Columbus, Ohio. Tyler had just graduated high school and had recently enlisted in the United States Marine Corps, with basic training scheduled for the following year. That evening, the group lined up for the Fireball, a pendulum ride that swings a gondola of riders up to roughly 40 feet in the air, while spinning at approximately 13 revolutions per minute. The ride had passed inspection earlier that day. At about 7:24 p.m., with the gondola fully loaded and arcing high over the Midway at full speed, witnesses heard a sharp cracking sound. One entire row of seats sheared off the ride's arm and separated completely, hurling riders through the air and sending twisted metal crashing onto the concrete below. Tyler was thrown an estimated 40 to 50 feet before hitting the ground. 7 other riders, ranging in age from 14 to 42, were launched from their seats or struck by flying debris. Panicked fairgoers scattered as bystanders rushed in and dialed 911. Ohio State Highway Patrol troopers, Columbus firefighters, and paramedics flooded the Midway within minutes, establishing a triage perimeter around the wreckage. Medics attempted life-saving measures on Tyler where he fell, but he was pronounced dead at the fairgrounds. The Franklin County coroner later stated that Tyler died from blunt force trauma to the head, trunk, and lower extremities, comparing the impact to a high-speed car crash with ejection. All rides at the fair were immediately shut down. A manufacturer's metallurgical examination later found that hidden internal corrosion inside a support beam had thinned the steel until it catastrophically failed. The Consumer Product Safety Commission sent a formal investigative letter to the ASTM Amusement Ride Committee, and Tyler's death became the driving force behind proposed Tyler's Law reforms to tighten mobile ride inspections nationwide. Indiana stage collapse. On August 13, 2011, roughly 10,000 to 12,000 fans packed the Hoosier Lottery grandstand at the Indiana State Fairgrounds in Indianapolis for a Sugarland concert. Opening act Sarah Bareilles had just finished her set, and Sugarland's equipment sat beneath a large, temporary roof structure on the main stage. The National Weather Service had issued a severe thunderstorm watch earlier that evening, warning of potential gusts between 60 and 70 miles per hour. At around 8:39 p.m., fair officials announced over the public address system that severe weather was approaching and that fans might need to shelter, but no formal evacuation order was issued. Officials believed they still had roughly 30 more minutes before the storm arrived. They were wrong. Around 8:46 p.m., an intense and localized gust slammed into the fairgrounds, violently whipping the stage scrim and overhead trusses. Spectators recorded on their phones as the massive roof, lighting grid, and speaker system buckled forward and collapsed in seconds into the front rows of the crowd. 24-year-old Megan Toothman, a high school cheerleading coach from Cincinnati, was standing near the front with friends when the structure came down. She was buried under twisted steel and rigging, suffering catastrophic head trauma and internal injuries. Indiana State Police, firefighters, and EMS established a mass casualty triage area on the track within minutes and transported the critically injured to Methodist Hospital and Wishard Medical Center. 5 people died that night. Megan underwent multiple surgeries and was placed on life support. Over the following 9 days, her condition did not improve, and on August 22nd, her family announced she had been declared brain dead. They chose to donate her organs, and she became the 7th person to die from the collapse. Investigations by Indiana OSHA and other agencies faulted the stage contractor and fair commission for inadequate structural design, insufficient ballast, and poor weather decision-making. The state established a $13.2 million settlement fund, and the disaster drove sweeping new standards for temporary outdoor stage engineering and severe weather evacuation protocols. Washington Drag Race. On September 5, 2016, the final day of the Evergreen State Fair in Monroe, Washington, crowds filled the grandstands at Evergreen Speedway to watch drag races that were a prominent part of the fair's motorsports lineup. 42-year-old Ed Ritter of Mill Creek, Washington, was an experienced motorcycle racer, who that day was riding a bike that was relatively new to him. Shortly after noon, Ed lined up alongside another rider for a head-to-head sprint down the strip. When the starting light flashed green, both riders launched hard, but Ed's motorcycle pulled ahead quickly, accelerating well beyond what the other racer could match. Timing equipment later showed Ed's bike approaching 97 miles per hour at the far end of the strip. Instead of decelerating inside the designated shutdown area, the motorcycle continued straight, overshooting the track entirely and heading toward a row of school buses that had been parked near the end of the course for use in demolition derby events. In full view of the grandstand crowd, Ed's bike slammed broadside into one of the unoccupied buses with tremendous force, sending debris across the area. The other racer coasted to a stop unharmed. Track safety staff and on-site medics reached Ed within moments and attempted life-saving measures, but Snohomish County deputies and the county medical examiner confirmed he was pronounced dead at the scene from blunt force trauma. Racing was immediately canceled for the day and the grandstands cleared. Sheriff's crash investigators documented skid marks, bike damage, and bus positioning to determine the primary cause. A fellow racer who had been just feet away told local media the crash should never have happened, criticizing the placement of immovable obstacles like school buses at the end of an active drag strip, and calling for longer runoff zones and improved barriers at future fair events. By the way, if you find this informative, I cover stories like these regularly. Consider subscribing if you'd like to see more. Now back to the video. South Carolina Inverter. On October 19, 2008, the final day of the South Carolina State Fair in Columbia, 49-year-old Jeff Duclef was working the Midway as a veteran traveling ride operator for North American Midway Entertainment. Jeff had years of experience with the circuit and was assigned that day to the Inverter, a large platform attraction that seated approximately 30 riders and rotated them fully upside down during operation. While the fair continued around him, Jeff was positioned inside a fenced employee-only zone adjacent to the ride, an area separated from the public and designated for staff. At some point Sunday afternoon, as the Inverter cycled through its rotation, the moving structure swung into Jeff's path inside the supposedly secure zone, striking him with enormous force. Other workers realized immediately that something had gone wrong and called for emergency medical help. Paramedics and fair security responded quickly, but despite their efforts, Jeff was pronounced dead at the scene. The next day, an autopsy performed by the Richland County Coroner's Office determined that Jeff died from a crushing injury to the chest, consistent with being struck by the heavy moving rig. North American Midway confirmed that the Inverter would remain closed while state investigators reviewed the incident. South Carolina's Department of Labor, Licensing and Regulation, along with OSHA-type regulators, opened a formal investigation to determine whether proper lockout and tagout procedures had been followed, and whether the ride should have been stationary with a worker in that position. Jeff's death was later cited in coverage of subsequent accidents at the same Columbia Fairgrounds, where a second worker was electrocuted during setup in 2010, and a ride malfunction injured 6 in 2011, mounting pressure on the Midway operator and fair management to overhaul worker safety protocols across the entire operation. Illinois catwalk collapse. On August 20th, 1966, the Illinois State Fairgrounds in Springfield was preparing for both the Tony Bettenhausen Memorial 100-mile championship race and a dramatic U.S. Army Green Beret demonstration, in which Special Forces soldiers were to rappel from a helicopter using a rope attached to a catwalk perched approximately 100 feet above the grandstand track. As part of the setup, workers fastened one end of a long, heavy rope to the narrow photographer's catwalk high atop the structure, and anchored the other end to a truck parked in the infield, intending to pull it taut before the show began. Spectators were already filling the front rows of the grandstand below. Workers began tightening the rope by driving the truck forward, unknowingly applying enormous lateral force to a lightly built catwalk that had never been designed to bear that kind of load. Without warning, a section of the catwalk ripped free from the top of the grandstand. Photographers Glenn Lockwood of San Bernardino, California, and Dale Mueller of Overland, Missouri, plunged roughly 100 feet to the track area below. The falling platform crashed down into the front rows, striking stage manager and electrician Ralph Hager, approximately 48 years old, on the ground and injuring dozens of others around him. The Sangamon County Rescue Squad and medical personnel moved through twisted steel and splintered seating to reach victims as ambulances transported at least 30 to 38 injured people to Springfield hospitals. Ralph died from crushing injuries caused by the falling platform. All 3 fatalities made the collapse the deadliest disaster in Illinois State Fair history at that time. A coroner's jury ruled the deaths accidental, and the incident prompted major scrutiny of the decision to anchor a demonstration rope to a lightly supported grandstand structure, leading to tightened rules on temporary rigging, mandatory engineering reviews for promotional stunts, and the permanent cancellation of the Green Beret rappelling demonstration at the fair. North Carolina Bonzai. On October 24, 2002, at approximately 10:55 in the morning, 41-year-old Irvin Allen was working as a ride attendant on the Bonzai, a pendulum-style attraction at the North Carolina State Fair Midway in Raleigh. Irvin had worked for the Midway operator Amusements of America for 12 years, and had specifically returned to the traveling show that season after taking a year off. The Bonzai swung its loaded car back and forth in increasingly wide arcs, with riders passing close to the operator platform during each cycle. As the ride moved through its arc, Irvin was standing on the platform in the path of the oncoming seats. When the loaded car swung through the station, the legs of a teenage girl from Franklinton struck Irvin squarely, knocking him off the platform. He was then struck again by the ride structure itself and hurled completely over the adjacent Starship attraction, finally landing near a pizza stand on the Midway. Stunned bystanders who watched him fly over the top of a neighboring ride scrambled to alert fair officials and call for emergency help. The teenage rider suffered a serious leg injury from the impact. Emergency responders rushed to both victims, but despite rapid intervention, Irvin was pronounced dead. The Bonzai was immediately closed, and the area roped off as investigators began interviewing witnesses. North Carolina's Department of Labor and OSHA-type regulators subsequently scrutinized Amusements of America's operating procedures, focusing on whether staff were trained to maintain a safe distance from moving equipment and whether mechanical interlocks or other safeguards were adequate. Irvin's death was later cited in national roundups of major fair ride accidents as a key example of a worker fatally stepping into the path of a pendulum ride, reinforcing its place as a cautionary case among industry regulators. South Carolina electrocution. On Monday, October 11, 2010, the South Carolina State Fair in Columbia had not yet opened its gates to the public. Crews were still working long hours across the Midway, assembling and wiring attractions ahead of opening day. 43-year-old Roger Thompson was part of a team helping assemble and wire the Rainbow Ride, a long-arm attraction known for sweeping riders in a wide arc high above the Midway. That Monday afternoon, with no riders present anywhere on the fairgrounds, Roger was servicing the electrical systems that powered the Rainbow's motors and lights when he came into contact with live current. Co-workers saw him collapse and immediately recognized what had happened. They called 911, cut power to the area, and attempted to render aid while waiting for paramedics to arrive. Emergency responders transported Roger, but officials later confirmed that he died from the electrocution. Fair General Manager Gary Goodman spoke with local media, emphasizing that the Rainbow had not been running at the time and that the electrical area Roger was working in was never accessible to fairgoers, making clear that rider safety was not at issue. South Carolina's Department of Labor, Licensing and Regulation opened a formal investigation to determine whether proper lockout and tagout procedures had been followed, and whether the ride's power supply had been fully de-energized before Roger began work on the system. Roger's death was the second worker fatality at the Columbia Fairgrounds in 3 years, following Jeff Ducleff's death in 2008, and both cases were cited in coverage of a subsequent 2011 ride malfunction, compounding public pressure on fair management and Midway operators to implement systemic safety improvements before workers ever set foot near the equipment. Texas Skyride collapse. On October 21, 1979, the final day of the State Fair of Texas, gondola cars on the Swiss Skyride carried families 80 feet above the packed Midway at Fair Park in Dallas, offering sweeping views of the grounds as strong autumn winds swept across the city. 91-year-old Fred Millard was aboard one of the gondolas with his wife Sandra, who was 35, and their young grandchildren. Late that afternoon, with gusts reaching approximately 40 miles per hour or higher, one gondola car snagged on a tower assembly along the cable line and stalled while additional cars continued moving behind it. Several gondolas backed up against the stopped car. When a fourth car jammed, the overloaded roller assembly flipped, and the main support cable jumped off the tower, sending 2 gondolas plummeting roughly 80 feet toward the Midway below. Fred's gondola ripped through the canvas roof of a tent and smashed into the asphalt and skee-ball machines underneath. Fred was killed in the impact. Sandra and the grandchildren suffered severe injuries, as did nearby concession workers and bystanders. The second falling gondola crashed moments later, injuring more people but causing no additional fatalities. The chaos deepened when a rescue vehicle reportedly struck a person on the ground while racing through the crowded Midway. Dallas Fire Department units were alerted at approximately 4:42 p.m. and responded with multiple engines, ambulances, and aerial cherry-picker trucks. Firefighters methodically removed stranded passengers from gondolas still hanging on the disabled cable, while at least 13 injured victims were transported to Parkland Hospital and other facilities. Safety officials and fire service training retrospectives later pointed to evidence that the ride had been operated in winds exceeding its safe limits, and that cutoffs may have been overridden to clear riders from the cable faster, making the Texas Skyride disaster an enduring example of the consequences of ignoring weather-related safety margins at a major state fair. If you found value in this, a subscription helps me continue researching these stories. Thanks for watching.